All right. Well, hi everyone. I am Ed. I'm one of the co-founders of Hustle Badger, and today we're going to be talking about success metrics. So, a few little bits of housekeeping info right up front. So, firstly, this is being recorded. We will share the recording afterwards. Um, we will share a few links of things that we mentioned in this, and you'll find a lot more information on the Hustle Badger website. Please do stay on mute so that we don't have background noise disturbing us. But if you've got questions, I would love to hear them. And you can stick them in the chat at any moment, and I will try and get around to them when I can. And then usually, I've got a bunch of slides I'm going to talk through and all that sort of stuff. If I can't answer your question as I'm going through, I will go back to the chat and answer them at the end, and I will stay on for a little bit longer. So before we dive into success metrics, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Hustle Badger. So Hustle Badger provides support and training for product managers and other people in the tech space. And what makes us different is that we are like very, very practical advice based on the sort of operating experience that I have, that Susanna, my co-founder who's on the call, has, and the people, other people who contribute and write our articles have. And we've put this together based on our experience working in the tech industry for a number of years and holding executive roles and so on. But we've designed it to accelerate your career as well. And we're like, okay, what would make us have got to where we got to even faster if we did it again? And because of that, we wanted to make this all of our materials just like very, very immediately applicable. So you can kind of pick them up and get going with them straight away. You don't have to wade through huge courses or wait for start dates or anything like that. And we try to make it as comprehensive as possible. So there's sort of three kind of main strands to what we do. We do have courses if you want to go and do a deep dive on a particular topic. We have a wiki and template library if you just want to pick up stuff and put it into action straight away. And we also have a Slack community if you've got questions or need kind of support on anything we don't cover, or just want a bit of a, have a chit chat with fellow PMs. So this talk, and I've forgotten to change the headline there, we're actually not talking about customer journey mapping. We're talking about product analytics. We're talking about how to find success metrics. So this is one of the sections of our product analytics course. And if you want to go deeper on the other topics that we mention here, then you can check out this course, and it's linked here. You'll find it on our website fairly easily. But as I say, we'll be sharing this presentation at the end. Okay, success metrics. So very, very quickly, we're going to cover four things today. So what are success metrics? Why are success metrics useful? How do you find your success metrics? And what kind of checks should you go through to ensure that your success metrics are actually good ones? So with that, I will kick off. So what is a success metric? So a success metric, here's an example. A success metric, if your objective for your team is grow your user base, your success metric might be 7-day new users. So how many new users have you got in the past 7 days? And I define it in the following way. So it's the single best. So you're typically choosing one metric to be a tiebreaker. You might be looking at lots of metrics, but going to use one metric as your success metric. It's quantifiable, so it's something you can actually measure. It's objective. It's not a matter of opinion or gut feel. It's got a real quality to it. It's a measure of performance, so it tells you how well you are doing, right? And it relates to the business performance. And you can measure it over time because you can see it change over time, and it's not a constant. Then you can make decisions based on it. And so that's my definition of a success metric: single best quantifiable measure of performance over time. And why do you have them? I mean, you have success metrics to guide what you're building. So when you set yourself an objective, your success metric, your objective for me is always something qualitative, because businesses are multidimensional, users and customers are multidimensional, and you can't describe everything that you want to do in a really comprehensive and inspiring way with a single dimension metric. But the problem with qualitative descriptions is that they are subjective, and you don't know if you're getting closer to them or not. So when you complement them with metrics, the metrics tell you if you're getting closer to where you want to go or not. And a success metric, having a single metric that you use kind of above all others to quantify your progress, gives you a common yardstick for measuring, how well different features that you are working on are performing, what is the potential for different opportunities you're looking at. And if it's shared with other teams, you can look at your performance versus other teams' performance. So that's why they are useful. And another way of thinking about this is to think about the difference between leading and lagging metrics. So success metrics are always leading metrics, and they predict your business impact that you will have. So leading metrics, these are not kind of discrete kind of categories, right? So depending on the context that you're talking about metrics, a metric could appear in either the leading or the lagging bucket. These are more kind of descriptors for the role that any given metric is taking at a time. But a leading metric is generally predicts the future, whereas a lagging metric describes the past. Leading metrics move quickly, whereas lagging metrics move slowly. Leading metrics predict business outcomes, whereas lagging metrics are actual business outcomes. And usually you have a large team, your team has a large influence over leading metrics, whereas they might have a small influence over lagging metrics because there'll be lots of people, lots of different teams influencing lagging metrics. And so kinds of examples for leading metrics, you have things like the engagement of features, the adoption of users of different parts of the product, the activity, and so on. Whereas lagging metrics are things like revenue, profit, ARR, LTV, GMV. So the lagging metrics are the ones that you ultimately want to move, because those are the ones that tell you whether your business is successful, how much money are you making, what is the value of the company, are you going to get paid if you're a founder, all those sorts of things. But those lagging metrics, it's very difficult to see if you're making a change to just one little part of the business, whether that change has actually affected the metrics you want it to. So you use your leading metrics, and your success metric is a leading metric, to act as a predictor that what you're doing is moving in the right direction. So that's kind of like what success metrics are, why they're useful. So if you're going to pick a success metric, then I talk people through these kind of 4 steps generally. So figuring out what your business metric is, figuring out what is the mechanism by which you can move it, thinking about what are the candidates and selecting between them, and then actually defining the metric you're going to use or giving it a kind of a formal definition. So the first thing you want to understand is, what is the business metric that you're trying to move? So some people might call this the North Star. I often think of this as what is the most commonly talked about metric in your company? So generally companies will just like all hands, every presentation, there's some reference to this metric. And maybe there's 2 or 3, but usually it's 1. It might be revenue. If you're in a SaaS business, it might be ARR. If you're in a marketplace, it might be GMV, gross merchandise value, or GMS. So GSV, gross service value. You've probably recognized one of these metrics. So that is probably what you're ultimately trying to move. But you're not going to use that to determine whether an individual feature that you build is successful or not, because it's too kind of blunt an instrument, and you're not going to have enough. You're not going to be able to pull out the effect of your feature change from all the other things going on, from all the other teams and external factors and so on. But that's the first step in kind of figuring out what your success metric is. You need to know what you're predicting, right? If your success metric is a predictor for a business metric, you need to know what you're trying to predict. The second thing you want to do is think through the mechanism. So the mechanism is like the narrative or the description of how what you are doing is going to change that business metric eventually. So a couple of examples here. So Juno is a marketplace for freelancers. And we had a hypothesis that making briefs easier to post was going to increase our revenue. And the way that we got there was saying, okay, we want to make it easier for clients to create and post briefs in our marketplace, because the more briefs that they place, then the more bookings they'll make, and more bookings will increase our commission and our overall revenue. Okay, so very kind of simple step by step, kind of like that is, we're going to work on briefs, and that's how we think it's going to generate more revenue. For Notion, you could imagine, okay, they're going to work on some AI assistant. And here we're saying, like, okay, the AI assistant is going to write short summaries of Notion pages for users. These explanations are going to start filling out our AI offering and creating additional value for users. And once we've got enough functionality in our AI offering, we can package this as a separate add-on, and we can charge users for that. And that will increase our revenue per user and therefore our ARR. Okay, so these descriptions are qualitative. They help you kind of just like get straight in your mind, like, why are we building this thing? And this is super important. I cannot kind of overstate the number of times I've been talking to product teams about what they're building, and they start going through this process and they realize that what they're building does not move the business metric that they want it to. There's just no kind of logical connection between them. So you obviously kind of make sure, just at a fundamental level, what you're building makes sense, but also you start to build up this picture of almost like a funnel, right? Of like, what are we doing? And then how does that have this knock-on effect, knock-on effect, knock-on effect that at some point is going to move our business metric? Now, if you think about a funnel in a kind of e-commerce-y type of way, then this becomes very obvious, right? You've got in an e-commerce funnel, so if you're thinking about ASOS, Amazon, something like that, you've got traffic reaching your site. Maybe they go through some kind of search process, probably. Then they hit a product page. Then they decide they want to buy that product. They go to the checkout page, and they make a transaction and converts it into revenue. Okay, so whether you're working on a SaaS business or you're doing a marketplace or something else, right? You can create this funnel from what you are doing, the work you are doing, the feature you're working on, all the way through to the business metric. Like there's this kind of chain of events. And if you go closer to the business metric, you choose a more lagging metric, then that's going to have generally less traffic. It's going to be more accurate predictor of the leading metric because it's closer to it. But it's going to be less responsive because it's more lagging. And the more leading you go, the more traffic it will be, the more sensitive it will be, the faster you'll get results, but the less well it might correlate with the final business metric. And for each of these different steps, there's probably a whole bunch of ways that you can, like different actions you can think of at this stage. So it's not just, do you hit the page? It's like, what do you do on that page? But you could also provide additional conditions to refine the metric in certain ways. So are you logged in? Are you a returning user? Are you a new user? All these, you can segment your traffic as well as looking at what that traffic is doing, to give you some ideas here. Okay, so having got the kind of mechanism, you've described this qualitatively, you can start to kind of actually like then sketch this out in different phases and figure out what this looks like. This could be quite short as well. I've kind of got 5 steps here, but you might only have like 2 or 3 steps between what you're working on and where you're going. If you can get it more granular, you'll have a few more options, because here we can see like, okay, if we're working on the product page and we're making changes here, is our success metric, the number of people that come to the product page? Is it something we do on the product page? Or is this something further down the line? Like, actually, are we expecting changes on the product page to change what happens on the checkout page? Like, more people get through to the checkout page, more people convert on the checkout page. So you should be at this point starting to identify, okay, what are some candidates then for metrics that we expect to be further up the funnel that are going to indicate that we're on the right track, right? And these will just be hypotheses, right? But they should be hypotheses that make sense given the mechanism that you've put in. So now, if you want to be super rigorous about this, you can do a correlation analysis, and we explain how to do that in the course. But if you don't have the time or analytics to do that, or you just want to do something a little bit simpler, then the thing to do is basically to figure out kind of just conceptually like what feels like the best predictive metric here. So again, you might say like, okay, actually just getting through people to like the product page, number of pages viewed, that is going to be the best predictor of revenue. The more product pages that get viewed, the more revenue we make. That's my hypothesis. We're going to use number of product pages viewed as the success metric. Okay, great. What you've got to remember at this point is that you need to then define that metric more than just sort of in a bit more specifically. What do I mean by that? Well, let's have a look at the time period. So here's kind of a fake data set, right? But you can see number of daily signups for some apps, and this is might be fairly typical. You've got quite a lot of variation day to day. So daily signups is the gray number, and you can see it's quite noisy, and it's quite hard to see what's happening. But then if you look at daily signups on a 7-day average, you can see this blue line. You can see like, okay, there's some weekly variation and so on. And if you take that over a 14-day average, then you're starting to see that it's a fairly steady line upwards, right? So, but also, you know, if you take your signups over 14 days, you're going to have a 14-day lag on the, you know, pushing a change is going to take 14 days. It's going to take 2 weeks before you see a full impact of what that change has done. So when you increase the time period that you're sampling over, you're reducing the noise, but you are increasing the delay with what you're working on. That what makes sense for you is going to be dependent on your business. But this is kind of one of the first things to think about is like what kind of time period are you sampling your data over? Second thing to think about is like relative versus absolute. So a relative number is generally a percentage or a ratio. It's things like, we've got some examples, I'll talk through it. So an absolute is like an absolute, it's an actual number. So how many new users signed up to our website? 10,000. Okay, that is an absolute number. What percentage of those new users went and activated? 56%. That is a relative number. So again, this is something to think through, like what is useful, because absolute numbers, they will show you, you know, they're kind of real in the sense that, you know, you measure them, you get them, they're not calculated. They tell you about the magnitude of things, but they don't tell you about the relative change. So if you get 1,000 more new users tomorrow versus today, you don't know if that's, you know, is that good? Well, it depends where you started. And then with relative numbers, they are calculated so you can make them very obvious, like, okay, did we increase this 20%? Did we, they're kind of standardized for seasonality and things like that. So if you have a decrease in traffic over Christmas or an increase in traffic over Black Friday, then a lot of your metrics might go haywire. If you're converting them into relative numbers, they should stay relatively the same, right? But the problem with relative metrics is, yeah, you don't know the absolute numbers, right? So you may want to think about balancing these and being like, okay, even if we calculate one of these as a success metric, we want some others as health metrics. So that's what we've done in these examples. So for Udemy, we said, okay, success metric, we'll have an absolute metric here, courses started, but we'll balance that with some health metrics, courses per learner and course completion rate. Reverse for Etsy, we'll have a revenue per user as a relative metric. That's a success metric, but our health metrics will be total users and total items sold. And a good way to think about this is like, once you've got your candidate metric, think about what would you do if you were really cynically just trying to move your success metric and you weren't concerned about the overall success of the business or your customers? So in Udemy's cases, you know, you might say like, oh, actually everyone that turns up on our homepage, we're going to automatically enroll them in 3 courses. because that's going to drive up courses started in absolute terms. It's obviously going to completely tank your course completion rate because no one's going to complete courses that they're auto-enrolled for. Okay. So having some health metrics gives you some kind of guardrails or some counterbalances these kind of like cynical moves you can do. But it still means that you're going to determine whether things are good to do or not based on your success metric. Okay. So some other things you can think through, and these are just kind of general, like what makes a good success metric, what makes a good metric. Like good metrics, when you ship something that is, works, it moves. And when you don't ship something, it doesn't move. Right. So they're very clear indicators that you are moving in the right direction. That's like almost by definition, like a good metric. So other things you want to think about, like, are these metrics intuitive? You might have a really kind of, statistically precise and accurate metric, but if no one can understand what you're talking about, they're going to doubt it. It's going to be very difficult to have conversations about what you're actually seeing in the data. And that's going to inhibit your ability to make decisions and take action, which is the whole point. So is it measurable? Can you actually get the data? And again, just I've seen a lot of teams where they're like, oh, what's your OKR? It's this is our OKR. This is the metrics we're going to use. Like, great. What's the baseline? Like, oh, actually, we don't know. And then 3 days later, they come back and they're like, yeah, we can't actually measure this. Like, okay, well, obviously, if you can't measure your metric, it's no use. So if you think of a metric and it feels great, make sure you can actually get the data and you get it reliably before you commit to it. Actionable, does it help you make decisions? That's the sort of the end goal, is like, do you get to make good decisions or not with your metrics? And is it in your control? Is it influenced? Is it clear how much your change comes from what you're doing versus what everyone else might be doing or external events? So 4 kind of like checks there that you want to think about. And I'll add to those kind of like 4 checks a few principles, like whenever you're working with metrics. So firstly, again, like, you know where they came from. It's not that you can measure them, it's that source, when you're putting it in a chart, is there. Like you've said where that chart has been drawn from so that other people can replicate the analysis. It's auditable. You label your charts so people know what they're looking at. You link your sources so people can go back to it. You work from a hypothesis. So you always have a working understanding of like why something has changed. And you have a theory about why what you're building is going to change what you're working on. Their definition is stable over time. So you're not constantly changing the definition that we've talked about. And that means you can compare them over time on a like-for-like basis to make decisions. And you know what good is. So if it goes up 20%, that is either a good thing or a bad thing, but it's not a kind of we don't know thing. That was it. That was a very quick run through success metrics. Do you have any questions?
I do, if I may.
Yeah, go for it, Daria.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I have a question on the previous slide that you've shown with a chart where it doesn't change or it does change, depending on the efforts that we're making. What if there are some kind of external factors impacting the metric in the meantime? Like, do we shield ourselves from it? Do we factor it in? Do we add some broader context?
So again, this is like an ideal metric, right? So ideally, there would be no external factors. You'd be the only team that made any difference to this. Yeah, that's very rarely, if ever, going to be the case, right? So you're going to have to make some trade-offs, almost certainly, about where is your metric good and where is it not so good. And so, yes, you want to minimize the amount of external factors affecting it. If you're not careful, you're going to end up with a metric that no one cares about because it's so niche, it doesn't really affect the overall business metric. So that's generally a bit of a trade-off that you've got. And then if there's still a lot of other external factors, you might have to control for it using an A/B test or something like this.
Thank you.
So Michelle is asking, can you explain a little bit more about relative and absolute? Let's go back to relative and absolute. So Michelle, were there particular questions you had about relative and absolute?
Yeah, so I'm a product designer, so I'm coming to this workshop with not too much knowledge about this. So this is the first time I'm hearing about it. So if you were to explain it to me, like, yeah, what is relative versus absolute in a
Okay,
very simple way?
very simple way. So let's walk through this Udemy example. So a, an absolute number is it has a real number, like how many courses how many course starts have we had, how many pounds in the bank account, how many apples in our shopping basket. It's kind of like it's just as I say, like a real number. Whereas
Hmm.
a relative number is it's either a ratio, so it's like the number of this given X number of that, or it's a percentage. So you're taking two or more absolute numbers and you're combining them in some calculation to see um, to see what's going on. So for Udemy, if we say, okay, if we just count the number of courses started, that's an absolute number, we can see that yesterday 10,000 courses were started. If we
Hmm.
look at the number of courses started per learner, over I don't know, let's say over 3 months, that might be like 2.1, right? So every learner is on average calculating, starting 2.1 courses.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Did you want me to talk a little bit more about the pros and cons, or was that clear?
That was clear.
Yeah, fine. Great.
Thank you.
Luca is asking, how would a funnel that you showed us look like for B2B to C SaaS that always require a sales cycle of minimum 2 months to almost 2 years? Okay, so this one, yeah. So, I mean, SaaS is definitely more difficult, right? Because if you're working on a SaaS product with let's call it a 12-month sales cycle, and probably they're signing up to a 2 or 3 year contract, and then they might renew or not, then your business metric that you want to change ultimately is probably something like ARR, like annual recurring revenue, right? And that's only going to change when you sign a new deal or you lose an existing customer. So the questions you have there are, okay, actually one step back from ARR is like, what is our win rate on new deals? What is our pipeline and number of deals we reach out to on a monthly basis? What is our churn rate on a monthly basis? Can I affect any one of those three metrics? And so you're then looking at, okay, I'm building, I don't know, permissions, common feature in B2B SaaS, right? So I'm building out different permission levels. Is this going to change the churn rate of users? Yeah, maybe it is, because actually we've had some customers saying they have churned because we don't have the right permission levels for them because they're a very large organization. Okay, so if we can then estimate, like, yeah, you get into kind of being like, okay, so actually we can change the churn rate because we can change the this work, we can affect it with this work we're doing on a particular feature. There may be other intermediate steps where you say, we'll work on a feature which affects this metric, which then affects churn rate, something like this. So um, does that make sense? Yes, Luca's got that right. Suman, in B2B or B2B2C situation where the business is global, how do you suggest to select a metric? Because the market situation might be different in different regions. So I think the question is that, do you have to pick a metric that is valid across the whole business or across multiple teams? Or are you just using it for your team? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, apologies. We were using it for our product lines, our team, but the trouble is, the maturity of the regions are not equal, of course, because of various situations. We may know that what might move the dial a little bit, But then, of course, if I just looking at the bottom line, the holistic revenue for the company, then probably we should not go there for obvious reasons, because that might not have the significant impact on the revenue. Now, this is the dilemma for us all the time, because we are listening to the customer, what they want. We know that that particular market needs something different, but prioritizing that, cutting through the tips, not necessarily very easy. Now, I was wondering, just as a as a as a product team member, or as a PM, or as a just in isolation, can we move anything, or it's kind of holistic umbrella of how can you influence? That's what it is really. You can't do much because it's more controlled by the organization.
Yeah, I think so. Let's go back to sort of the basics, right? Like right at the start, we said, a success metric is your single best quantifiable measure of performance over time. And I also think of it as like, your success metric is a tool to help you make the best decisions. So I make the best decisions as in like to maximize the impact that your product team can have and define what impact is. So if, what is the metric that makes, is the most useful kind of yardstick for you to measure your progress? That may not be the same as, you've got a senior product leader who wants to standardize how they track impact from different teams, and so that they can then, work on how they're allocating their teams. So in that case, you might have to work on a kind of suboptimal metric because of the needs of the wider organization. Or you might have to have some conversion rate where you say, look, we're going to focus like day to day on this metric, but when we do our quarterly reporting or annual reporting on how much impact we've done overall, we're going to report on this other metric so that we can compare across different teams. So I think there are a few different ways of tackling this. But always you want to come back to sort of like, well, why do we have this metric? Why do we have this tool in the first place? And what is the benefit to us? Because what you don't want to do is let the team become sort of a slave to the metric, rather than the metric serve the team.
Of course. Yeah. Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, can I ask a question as well?
Yeah, go for it.
So it's regarding the course that you shared with us.
Mm-hmm.
So it says that it is like in weeks, right?
Yes.
And is it like is it going to like activate per weeks, or once I finish the?
So our courses are all self-serve, and we put a time on them. So we say this is a 5-week course because that is paced at about 2 to 3 hours of learning a week, which we think is a sustainable rate of learning for people in a full-time job. Because it's self-serve, though, you could go through it much faster. You could do it in a couple of days if you're going to work full-time on it, or you could, spread it out over a couple of months if you wanted to take it a bit slower.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Anyone else have any questions? Nope. Super. Well, look, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. We'll wrap up here. And as I say, we'll send out a little follow-up with links to the course and some of the articles that we've got on the website on these topics as well, if you want to dig any deeper. All right.